May 11, 1945, 4 o'clock in the morning, the jungle floor of Luzon, Philippines is absolute darkness. A black void where the humidity feels heavy enough to choke on. Rain drips from the triple canopy foliage, masking the snap of twigs and the shuffle of fabric. Inside a shallow, muddy foxhole tent, Sergeant John McKinney is asleep. He is exhausted, his body worn down by weeks of relentless jungle warfare, his rifle resting just inches from his hand. The silence is not broken by an explosion or a scream, but by the whisper of canvas parting. A shadow moves inside the tent. A Japanese officer, Sergeant Fukutaro Mori, creeping in on bare feet. In his hand, the dull glint of a polished katana rises through the gloom. There is no warning. The blade slashes down, aiming to sever McKinney's head from his shoulders in a single stroke. The steel bites deep, slicing off part of McKinney's ear and carving into his scalp, shocking him awake into a nightmare of blood and adrenaline. But Mori has made a fatal miscalculation. He has not killed the American. He has only cornered him. To understand the sheer ferocity of the 7 minutes that would define John McKinney's life, one must first understand the strange, fractured reality of the world in May 1945. History books often paint this month with the broad brushstrokes of victory. On May 8th, just 3 days before McKinney's ordeal, Nazi Germany had formally surrendered. In London, Paris, and New York, the streets were flooded with champagne, ticker tape, and weeping crowds celebrating VE Day. The Western world exhaled. The nightmare of the Third Reich was over, and a sense of finality washed over the globe. But on the other side of the planet, in the steaming, rot-filled gullies of the Philippine Islands, the war was not ending. It was becoming more primal. For the men of the U.S. 33rd Infantry Division, known as the Golden Cross, the news of German surrender was nothing more than a rumor from a different universe. They were deep in the mountains of Luzon, the largest island in the Philippines, engaged in a campaign that General Douglas MacArthur had promised would be a liberation. By May 1945, the major cities like Manila had fallen, and the American High Command had declared the area secure. The heavy armored divisions and the massive artillery barrages had largely moved on or ceased, leaving the infantry to conduct what was euphemistically called mopping up operations. Mopping up suggests a janitorial task, something routine, low risk, and tidy. The reality on Luzon was a catastrophic meat grinder. The Japanese 14th Area Army, commanded by the legendary General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, had not surrendered. Instead, following a strategy of attrition, Yamashita had pulled his forces back into the spine of the Cordillera Central Mountains and the jagged rainforests of the Sierra Madre. They were not fighting to win anymore. They were fighting to bleed the Americans for every inch of green hell they occupied. The fighting here was stripped of the grand maneuvers seen in Europe. There were no sweeping tank charges across open plains. This was a war of three-man foxholes, tripwires strung across game trails, and grenades thrown from behind bamboo thickets. It was a war of intimacy, where death came at a range of 10 feet or less. The 33rd Division had been on the line for over 100 consecutive days of combat. They were haggard, their uniforms rotting off their bodies, their boots disintegrating in the constant wetness of the monsoon season. By the second week of May, the division was stretched thin near the Dingalan Bay area. They were tasked with rooting out the remnants of Japanese resistance that was supposedly scattered and ineffective. But the intelligence was dangerously wrong. The enemy was not scattered. They were coalescing. And they were being driven by a force more powerful than imperial decree: starvation. The Japanese soldiers hiding in the ridges overlooking the American lines were men living on the edge of human endurance. Cut off from all naval resupply by the relentless U.S. blockade, General Yamashita's once proud army had devolved into a foraging survivalist force. Reports from the time indicate that many Japanese units were subsisting on fewer than 800 calories a day, eating roots, rats, pythons, and occasionally resorting to ritual cannibalism. But this starvation did not make them docile. It sharpened them. They stripped down to breech-alouts, moving through the jungle with the silence of apex predators, driven by a singular biological need to acquire the Americans' K rations and M1 Garands. Sergeant John McKinney's unit, Company A of the 123rd Infantry Regiment, had been tasked with guarding a perimeter near the village of Tay Tay. This was not a fortified base with concrete bunkers and floodlights. It was a thinly spread line of foxholes dug into the mud, surrounded by dense Kogan grass that grew 6 feet high, tall enough to hide a standing army. The platoon was understrength, a common reality for the 33rd Division by this stage of the campaign. They were the tip of the spear, isolated in the blackness, acting as a tripwire for the main American force. On the night of May 10th, the moon was obscured by heavy cloud cover, plunging the perimeter into near-total darkness. The Japanese force gathering in the ravine below was not a small patrol. It was a reinforced company of approximately 100 men, led by seasoned officers who had studied the American patrol patterns. Their objective was not merely to harass, it was to overrun the outpost entirely, slaughter the defenders, and loot the supplies before vanishing back into the jungle. This was a coordinated, large-scale raid born of desperation. Inside the perimeter, the Americans settled into a restless sleep. They were confident in their heavy machine guns and their overlapping fields of fire. But the jungle renders technology useless if you cannot see your target. The Japanese knew the terrain better than the Americans ever could. They moved up the slopes, timing their movements with the rustling of the wind in the Kogan grass. They bypassed the trip flares. They crawled under the barbed wire. By 4 a.m., the enemy was not approaching the wire. They were already inside it. And the first man in their path, sleeping in a 3-man tent on the extreme flank of the line, was a soft-spoken Georgian named John McKinney. To comprehend how one man could dismantle an entire infantry squad in the span of a few minutes, we must look past the uniform and at the man wearing it. John R. McKinney was not a career soldier molded by the rigors of West Point, nor was he the stereotypical action hero of Hollywood fiction. He was a 24-year-old sharecropper from Screven County, Georgia. In the dust and pine woods of the rural South, McKinney had learned a trade far older than modern warfare: hunting for survival. For McKinney, a rifle was not a military abstraction. It was a tool for putting food on the table. In the Depression-era South, ammunition was expensive. Missing a shot didn't just mean a lost trophy, it meant going hungry. This background instilled in him a specific set of instincts that regular infantry training could not replicate. He possessed an innate wood sense, an ability to read terrain, to sense movement before seeing it, and to remain unnervingly calm when the brush rustled nearby. While other soldiers in the 33rd Division relied on massed fire and overlapping sectors, McKinney relied on snap shooting. The ability to raise a rifle and hit a moving target in a fraction of a second without conscious thought. When the Japanese officer slashed him, McKinney didn't freeze in terror. His hunter's brain bypassed the panic and immediately engaged the threat. The engagement that followed was also a brutal case study in technological disparity. McKinney was armed with the M1 Garand, the semi-automatic service rifle that General George Patton famously called the greatest battle implement ever devised. Weighing nearly 10 pounds and fed by an 8-round N-block clip, the Garand allowed a soldier to fire as fast as he could pull the trigger. In the tight, suffocating confines of the jungle, this semi-automatic capability was the difference between life and death. Opposing him, the Japanese raiders were armed primarily with Arisaka Type 99 rifles. The Arisaka was a robust weapon, but it was bolt action. For every shot a Japanese soldier fired, he had to manually cycle the bolt, reacquire his sight picture, and fire again. In a chaotic close-quarters brawl, that a split-second delay was an eternity. Furthermore, the Japanese officer who initiated the attack, Sergeant Mori, had chosen a weapon of psychological terror, the katana. While deadly silent and capable of horrific damage, the sword required close contact. Once Mori failed to kill McKinney with the first strike, the technological advantage swung violently back to the American. McKinney held a weapon that could deliver 8 rounds of .30-06 caliber death in seconds, and when empty, it was a heavy, steel-shod club capable of crushing bone. To view this event solely through American eyes is to miss the terrifying motivation of the enemy. Sergeant Mori and his raiders were not mindless automatons. They were men pushed beyond the brink of collapse. Captured diaries from the Luzon campaign reveal a collective psyche fractured by hunger and the shame of looming defeat. For these men, the raid on Company A was a transaction of survival. They were not just killing for the emperor. They were killing for the rice in the Americans' pockets and the rifles in their hands. This desperation changed their tactical behavior. A well-supplied army fights with caution and structure. A starving army fights with feral abandonment. They swarm the American position, not with cover and move tactics, but with a suicidal rush, indifferent to their own casualties. They screamed as they charged, partly to terrify the Americans, but also to psych themselves up for death. When they breached the perimeter, they didn't stop to secure the ground. They immediately began scavenging and slashing, creating a chaotic melee that neutralized the Americans' ability to call for artillery support. The physical space in which this battle occurred was a claustrophobic trap. McKinney's foxhole was part of a listening post, positioned slightly ahead of the main line to provide early warning. In daylight, this was a strategic advantage. At night, under the canopy of the rainforest, it was a tomb. The darkness was absolute. There were no streetlights, no ambient glow from a city, only the impenetrable black of the jungle floor. Combat at this range becomes almost purely sensory. It is the smell of unwashed bodies, the sound of labored breathing, the feeling of mud sucking at boots. McKinney could not rely on his eyes. He had to rely on the sudden shifts in air pressure when a body lunged at him, or the silhouette of a helmet against the slightly lighter gray of the sky. The jungle stripped away the structured warfare the army had taught him and returned him to the primal state of the hunter in the woods. But this time, the deer were armed, and they were hunting him back. The universe exploded into pain. One moment, John McKinney was drifting in the humid exhaustion of sleep. The next, a white-hot agony tore through the side of his head. The katana had come down with the weight of a guillotine, aiming for the neck, but missing by inches in the dark. Instead, it sliced through his left ear, severing a large portion of it, and carved a deep gash into his scalp. Blood immediately flooded his vision and hearing. Most men would have died right there, paralyzed by the shock of waking up to their own execution. But McKinney's reaction was instantaneous and feral. Before the Japanese officer could raise the sword for a second, finishing stroke, McKinney roared into action. He didn't reach for a pistol or a knife. His hand found the familiar wood of his M1 Garand. In the cramped confines of the tent, there was no room to level the barrel or aim. The rifle was too long, the space too tight. As the officer lunged again, McKinney swung the heavy walnut stock of the M1 upward in a violent arc. The steel butt plate connected with the officer's jaw with a sickening crunch. The force of the blow was so immense that it shattered the Japanese soldier's face and sent him reeling backward, collapsing onto the cot. McKinney didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his feet, the adrenaline masking the fact that he was bleeding profusely from the head. But the nightmare was only beginning. As McKinney killed the officer, a second silhouette appeared in the tent opening. Another raider, lunging with a bayonet. McKinney, still unable to bring his rifle to bear in the tangle of canvas and mosquito netting, reacted with pure instinct. He twisted his body, dodging the bayonet thrust that tore through his shirt, and delivered another crushing butt stroke to the second attacker's neck, dropping him instantly. Gasping for air, heart hammering against his ribs, McKinney stumbled out of the tent and into the pre-dawn rain. He expected to find his platoon rallying, his squad mates firing back. Instead, he stepped into a scene of total isolation. The foxhole mates nearby were either dead or pinned down, silenced by the initial wave of the assault. He was alone, and as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw them. Shadows were detaching themselves from the jungle wall, not 2 or 3, but dozens. A wave of enemy soldiers was pouring over the perimeter wire, moving with the terrifying fluidity of a flood. They were less than 10 yards away, and they were all looking at him. McKinney didn't scream. He didn't run. He raised his rifle. What followed was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a 36-minute frenzy of continuous, close-quarters slaughter. The Japanese wave crashed into his position, expecting to overrun a terrified conscript. Instead, they walked into a buzzsaw. McKinney fired from the hip, the muzzle flashes of his M1 lighting up the terrifying faces of the charging soldiers like a strobe light in a house of horrors. At this range, less than 5 yards, he couldn't miss. He dropped the first 3 men in rapid succession, the heavy .30-06 rounds punching through the starving attackers with kinetic finality. The en-bloc clip ejected with a ping. In the seconds it took to reload, the enemy was on him. A Japanese officer rushed him with a sword, while another soldier threw a grenade that landed dangerously close. McKinney didn't flinch. He kicked the grenade away just before it detonated, the concussion slapping against his chest, and slammed a fresh clip into the receiver. He shot the swordsman in the chest, then swung the rifle barrel right to drop 2 more soldiers emerging from the Kogan grass. The fighting was so intimate that the barrel of his rifle was burning his hand. When the M1 clicked empty again and a soldier lunged at him from the dark, McKinney didn't have time to reload. He reversed the weapon and smashed the stock into the attacker's skull, shattering the wood. He discarded the broken rifle, dove into a nearby foxhole, grabbed a fallen comrade's M1, and came up firing again. To the Japanese raiders, it must have seemed as if they were attacking a fortified bunker manned by a dozen men. McKinney was moving constantly, firing from the left of the foxhole, ducking, reappearing on the right, then scrambling to a secondary position to fire from a different angle. He was a ghost in the smoke, a singular force of destruction that refused to die. Every time the Japanese tried to organize a charge to overwhelm him, McKinney cut down the leaders, breaking their momentum and turning the assault into a confused, bloody stumble. For over half an hour, the jungle echoed with the deafening roar of his rifle and the screams of the dying. McKinney was bleeding from his head. His uniform was soaked in mud and gore, and he was operating on a level of adrenaline that borders on the supernatural. He didn't stop until the bolt of his rifle locked back on an empty chamber and no new shadows moved against the wire. The screams faded. The gunfire sputtered out, and as the smoke drifted lazily into the humid air, the only sound left was the ragged, heaving breath of one man standing alone in a field of the dead. The sun rose slowly over the mountains of Luzon, burning off the morning mist to reveal a landscape that looked less like a battlefield and more like an abattoir. As the grey light filtered through the canopy, the men of Company A cautiously emerged from their fighting positions. The firing had stopped, replaced by a heavy, metallic silence, the kind that only exists in the presence of mass death. Reinforcements arriving from the main perimeter were greeted by a sight that defied military logic. Around the foxhole, where John McKinney had made his stand, the ground was carpeted with bodies. They were piled on top of one another, tangled in the Kogan grass, and slumped over the sandbags. It was a radius of absolute destruction. When the officers began the grim task of counting the dead, the numbers were staggering. Lying directly around McKinney's position were 38 Japanese soldiers. 2 more were found inside his tent, their skulls crushed by the force of his rifle butt. Further sweeps of the jungle perimeter revealed more blood trails dragging off into the brush, indicating that countless others had been wounded and retreated. In the center of this carnage sat Sergeant McKinney. He was alive, but barely recognizable. His uniform was stiff with dried blood, both his own and that of the men he had killed. His left ear was hanging by a shred of skin, and his face was a mask of exhaustion. When a medic rushed over to treat him, stunned by the sheer volume of enemy dead surrounding this one man, he asked McKinney what had happened. McKinney, in his slow, quiet drawl, simply replied, "I think I got a few of them." He hadn't just got a few. In 7 minutes of combat, John McKinney had single-handedly neutralized nearly half of an attacking infantry company. He had fired over 100 rounds, used 3 different rifles, and engaged in hand-to-hand combat multiple times. The official report would later note that the density of the bodies was so high that it was impossible to walk around the foxhole without stepping on the dead. News of the one-man stand filtered up the chain of command with the speed of a shockwave. In a war defined by massive artillery barrages and fleet maneuvers, the intimacy of McKinney's fight stood out as an anomaly. It was a throwback to a more primitive era of warfare, a feat of arms that seemed to belong in the Iliad, rather than a modern after-action report. General MacArthur himself reviewed the file. There was no debate, no bureaucratic delay. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor was immediate. Yet, despite receiving the nation's highest military decoration from President Harry S. Truman in 1946, John McKinney remains one of the war's quietest heroes. He did not become a movie star like Audie Murphy. He did not write a best-selling memoir. There were no parades waiting for him in Screven County, only the pine woods and the quiet life he had left behind. This obscurity was partly by design. McKinney was a man of few words, a soldier who viewed his actions not as heroism, but as a terrifying necessity. His survival that night also served as the ultimate validation of the American infantry doctrine of the time. The emphasis on individual marksmanship and the semi-automatic superiority of the M1 Garand. Military analysts who studied the engagement concluded that with a bolt-action rifle, McKinney would have been overrun in the first 30 seconds. It was the fusion of the man's hunter instincts and the machine's rapid-fire capability that created an impenetrable wall of lead. But technology alone does not explain why he stood his ground when others would have broken. That explanation lies in the unquantifiable resilience of the human spirit when cornered. John McKinney passed away in 1997, decades removed from the humid terror of that Philippine night. For the rest of his life, he rarely spoke of the war. He returned to the soil of Georgia, living simply, a hunter who had once been the hunted. His story forces us to confront a raw truth about warfare that sanitized history books often ignore. We like to think of battles as chess matches moved by generals and won by strategy. But at its absolute zero, at 4 a.m. in a pitch-black jungle, war is not about strategy. It is about the friction between two human beings, stripped of civilization, fighting for the right to breathe. McKinney's 7 minutes on Luzon reveal that the line between a humble sharecropper and a lethal warrior is terrifyingly thin. It suggests that inside the quietest among us, there exists a capacity for survival that can defy all logic, all odds, and all reason. When the darkness came for John McKinney, he did not ask for mercy, and he did not wait for rescue. He simply did what he had always done in the woods of Georgia. He held his ground, he trusted his aim, and he refused to miss.